I Conquered Worry 32 True Stories. 6 Major Troubles Hit Me All at Once by C.I. Blackwood. Proprietor, Blackwood-Davis Business College, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. In the summer of 1943, it seemed to me that half the worries of the world had come to rest on my shoulders. For more than 40 years, I had lived a normal, carefree life with only the usual troubles which come to a husband, father, and businessman. I could usually meet these troubles easily, but suddenly wham! 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 6 major troubles hit me all at once. I pitched and tossed and turned in bed all night long, half dreading to see the day come, because I faced these 6 major worries.
1. My business college was trembling on the verge of financial disaster because all the boys were going to war, and most of the girls were making more money working in war plants without training than my graduates could make in business offices with training. 2. My older son was in service, and I had the heart-numbing worry common to all parents whose sons were away at war. 3. Oklahoma City had already started proceedings to appropriate a large tract of land for an airport, and my home, formerly my father's home, was located in the center of this tract. I knew that I would be paid only 1/10 of its value, and, what was even worse, I would lose my home, and because of the housing shortage, I worried about whether I could possibly find another home to shelter my family of 6. I feared we might have to live in a tent. I even worried about whether we would be able to buy a tent.
4. The water well on my property went dry because a drainage canal had been dug near my home. To dig a new well would be throwing $500 away because the land was probably being appropriated. I had to carry water to my livestock in buckets every morning for 2 months, and I feared I would have to continue it during the rest of the war. 5. I lived 10 miles away from my business school and I had a Class B petrol card. That meant I couldn't buy any new tires, so I worried about how I could ever get to work when the superannuated tires on my old Ford gave up the ghost. 6. My oldest daughter had graduated from high school a year ahead of schedule. She had her heart set on going to college, and I just didn't have the money to send her. I knew her heart would be broken.
One afternoon, while sitting in my office, worrying about my worries, I decided to write them all down, for it seemed no one ever had more to worry about than I had. I didn't mind wrestling with worries that gave me a fighting chance to solve them, but these worries all seemed to be utterly beyond my control. I could do nothing to solve them. So I filed away this typewritten list of my troubles, and, as the months passed, I forgot that I had ever written it. 18 months later, while transferring my files, I happened to come across this list of my 6 major problems that had once threatened to wreck my health. I read them with a great deal of interest and profit. I now saw that not one of them had come to pass.
Here is what had happened to them. 1. I saw that all my worries about having to close my business college had been useless because the government had started paying business schools for training veterans and my school was soon filled to capacity. 2. I saw that all my worries about my son in service had been useless. He was coming through the war without a scratch. 3. I saw that all my worries about my land being appropriated for use as an airport had been useless, because oil had been struck within a mile of my farm and the cost for procuring the land for an airport had become prohibitive. 4. I saw that all my worries about having no well to water my stock had been useless because, as soon as I knew my land would not be appropriated, I spent the money necessary to dig a new well to a deeper level and found an unfailing supply of water.
5. I saw that all my worries about my tires giving out had been useless, because by recapping and careful driving, the tires had managed somehow to survive. 6. I saw that all my worries about my daughter's education had been useless, because just 60 days before the opening of college, I was offered almost like a miracle an auditing job which I could do outside of school hours, and this job made it possible for me to send her to college on schedule. I had often heard people say that 99% of the things we worry and stew and fret about never happen, but this old saying didn't mean much to me until I ran across that list of worries I had typed out that dreary afternoon 18 months previously.
I am thankful now that I had to wrestle in vain with those 6 terrible worries. That experience has taught me a lesson I'll never forget. It has shown me the folly and tragedy of stewing about events that haven't happened, events that are beyond our control and may never happen. Remember, today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday.
Ask yourself, how do I know this thing I am worrying about will really come to pass? I can turn myself into a shouting optimist within an hour. By Roger W. Babson. Famous economist. Babson Park, Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts. When I find myself depressed over present conditions, I can, within 1 hour, banish worry and turn myself into a shouting optimist.
Here is how I do it. I enter my library, close my eyes, and walk to certain shelves containing only books on history. With my eyes still shut, I reach for a book, not knowing whether I am picking up Prescott's Conquest of Mexico or Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars. With my eyes still closed, I open the book at random. I then open my eyes and read for an hour, and the more I read, the more sharply I realized that the world has always been in the throes of agony, that civilization has always been tottering on the brink. The pages of history fairly shriek with tragic tales of war, famine, poverty, pestilence, and man's inhumanity to man. After reading history for an hour, I realized that bad as conditions are now, they are infinitely better than they used to be. This enables me to see and face my present troubles in their proper perspective, as well as to realize that the world as a whole is constantly growing better.
Here is a method that deserves a whole chapter. Read history. Try to get the viewpoint of 10,000 years and see how trivial your troubles are, in terms of eternity. How I Got Rid of an Inferiority Complex. By Elmer Thomas, United States Senator from Oklahoma. When I was 15, I was constantly tormented by worries and fears and self-consciousness. I was extremely tall for my age and as thin as a fence rail. I stood 6 feet 2 inches and weighed only 118 pounds. In spite of my height, I was weak and could never compete with the other boys in baseball or running games. They poked fun at me and called me Hatchface. I was so worried and self-conscious that I dreaded to meet anyone, and I seldom did, for our farmhouse was off the public road and surrounded by thick virgin timber that had never been cut since the beginning of time. We lived half a mile from the highway, and a week would often go by without my seeing anyone except my mother, father, and brothers and sisters.
I would have been a failure in life if I had let those worries and fears whip me. Every day and every hour of the day, I brooded over my tall, gaunt, weak body. I could hardly think of anything else. My embarrassment, my fear, was so intense that it is almost impossible to describe it. My mother knew how I felt. She had been a school teacher, so she said to me, "Son, you ought to get an education, you ought to make your living with your mind because your body will always be a handicap."
Since my parents were unable to send me to college, I knew I would have to make my own way, so I hunted and trapped a possum, skunk, mink, and raccoon one winter, sold my hides for $4 in the spring, and then bought 2 little pigs with my $4. I fed the pigs slop and later corn and sold them for $40 the next fall. With the proceeds from the sale of the 2 hogs, I went away to the Central Normal College located at Danville, Indiana. I paid $1.40 a week for my board and 50 cents a week for my room. I wore a brown shirt my mother had made me. Obviously, she used brown cloth because it wouldn't show the dirt. I wore a suit of clothes that had once belonged to my father. Dad's clothes didn't fit me, and neither did his old Congress gator shoes that I wore, shoes that had elastic bands in the sides that stretched when you put them on. But the stretch had long since gone out of the bands. And the tops were so loose that the shoes almost dropped off my feet as I walked. I was embarrassed to associate with the other students, so I sat in my room alone and studied. The deepest desire of my life was to be able to buy some store clothes that fit me, clothes that I was not ashamed of.
Shortly after that, 4 events happened that helped me to overcome my worries and my feeling of inferiority. One of these events gave me courage and hope and confidence and completely changed all the rest of my life. I'll describe these events briefly. First, after attending this normal school for only 8 weeks, I took an examination and was given a 3rd grade certificate to teach in the country public schools. To be sure, this certificate was good for only 6 months, but it was fleeting evidence that somebody had faith in me, the first evidence of faith that I ever had from anyone except my mother. Second,
A country school board at a place called Happy Hollow hired me to teach at a salary of $2 per day, or $40 per month. Here was even more evidence of somebody's faith in me.
Third, as soon as I got my first check, I bought some store clothes that I wasn't ashamed to wear. If someone gave me $1 million now, it wouldn't thrill me half as much as that first suit of store clothes for which I paid only a few dollars. Fourth, the real turning point in my life, the first great victory in my struggle against embarrassment and inferiority, occurred at the Putnam County Fair held annually in Bainbridge, Indiana. My mother had urged me to enter a public speaking contest that was to be held at the fair. To me, the very idea seemed fantastic. I didn't have the courage to talk even to one person, let alone a crowd. But my mother's faith in me was almost pathetic. She dreamed great dreams for my future. She was living her own life over in her son. Her faith inspired me to enter the contest. I chose for my subject about the last thing in the world that I was qualified to talk on, the fine and liberal arts of America. Frankly, when I began to prepare a speech, I didn't know what the liberal arts were, but it didn't matter much because my audience didn't know either.
I memorized my flowery talk and rehearsed it to the trees and cows 100 times. I was so eager to make a good showing for my mother's sake that I must have spoken with emotion. At any rate, I was awarded the first prize. I was astounded at what happened. A cheer went up from the crowd. The very boys who had once ridiculed me and poked fun at me and called me hatchet-faced now slapped me on the back and said, "I knew you could do it, Elmer." My mother put her arms around me and sobbed.
As I look back in retrospect, I can see that winning that speaking contest was the turning point of my life. The local newspapers ran an article about me on the front page and prophesied great things for my future. Winning that contest put me on the map locally and gave me prestige, and, what is far more important, it multiplied my confidence 100-fold. I now realize that if I had not won that contest, I probably would never have become a member of the United States Senate, for it lifted my sights, widened my horizons, and made me realize that I had latent abilities that I never dreamed I possessed. Most important, however, was the fact that the first prize in the oratorical contest was a year's scholarship in the Central Normal College.
I hungered now for more education. So, during the next few years from 1896 to 1900, I divided my time between teaching and studying. In order to pay my expenses at DePauw University, I waited on tables, looked after furnaces, mowed lawns, kept books, worked in the wheat and cornfields during the summer, and hauled gravel on a public road construction job. In 1896, when I was only 19, I made 28 speeches, urging people to vote for William Jennings Bryan for president. The excitement of speaking for Bryan aroused a desire in me to enter politics myself. So when I entered DePauw University, I studied law and public speaking. In 1899, I represented the university in a debate with Butler College, held in Indianapolis, on the subject resolved that United States senators should be elected by popular vote. I won other speaking contests and became editor-in-chief of the class of 1900 College Annual, the Mirage, and the university paper, the Palladium.
After receiving my A.B. degree at DePauw, I took Horace Greeley's advice only. I didn't go west, I went southwest. I went down to a new country, Oklahoma. When the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache Indian Reservation was opened, I homesteaded a claim and opened a law office in Lawton, Oklahoma. I served in the Oklahoma State Senate for 13 years, in the lower house of Congress for 4 years, and at 50 years of age, I achieved my lifelong ambition. I was elected to the United States Senate from Oklahoma. I have served in that capacity since March 4, 1927. Since Oklahoma and Indian Territories became the state of Oklahoma on November 16, 1907, I have been continuously honored by the Democrats of my adopted state by nominations first for state Senate, then for Congress, and later for the United States Senate.
I have told this story, not to brag about my own fleeting accomplishments, which can't possibly interest anyone else. I have told it wholly with the hope that it may give renewed courage and confidence to some poor boy who is now suffering from the worries and shyness and feeling of inferiority that devastated my life when I was wearing my father's cast-off clothes and gaiter shoes that almost dropped off my feet as I walked. Editor's note: it is interesting to know that Elmer Thomas, who was so ashamed of his ill-fitting clothes as a youth, was later voted the best-dressed man in the United States Senate.
I lived in the Garden of Alibi. RVC Bodley. Descendant of Sir Thomas Bodley, founder of the Bodleian Library, Oxford, author of Wind in the Sahara, The Messenger, and 14 other volumes. In 1918, I turned my back on the world I had known and went to Northwest Africa and lived with the Arabs in the Sahara, the Garden of Allah. I lived there 7 years. I learned to speak the language of the nomads. I wore their clothes, I ate their food, and adopted their mode of life, which has changed very little during the last 20 centuries. I became an owner of sheep and slept on the ground in the Arabs' tents. I also made a detailed study of their religion. In fact, I later wrote a book about Muhammad, entitled The Messenger.
Those 7 years which I spent with these wandering shepherds were the most peaceful and contented years of my life. I had already had a rich and varied experience. I was born of English parents in Paris, and lived in France for 9 years. Later I was educated at Eton and at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. Then I spent 6 years as a British Army officer in India, where I played polo, and hunted, and explored in the Himalayas as well as doing some soldiering. I fought through the First World War and, at its close, I was sent to the Paris conference as an assistant military attaché. I was shocked and disappointed at what I saw there. During the 4 years of slaughter on the Western Front, I had believed we were fighting to save civilization. But at the Paris Peace Conference, I saw selfish politicians laying the groundwork for the Second World War, each country grabbing all it could for itself, creating national antagonisms, and reviving the intrigues of secret diplomacy. I was sick of war, sick of the army, sick of society. For the first time in my career, I spent